They say the universe is vast enough to swallow a story whole and quiet enough to let a single voice linger until it becomes a prayer. Hear, then, this voice, soft as the breath of a sleeper, patient as a watchman on a long, cold night, and let it carry you across the black. We will speak of a single chapter in that endless ledger, of a legion of men carved from iron and oath, of a fortress that drifts like a slow, solemn moon, and of a burden kept locked and warm beneath the plates of their armor. The Imperium is an old thing, older than the oldest clocks, older than the oldest regrets. It stretches like a scar across the face of the galaxy, great arteries of light and darker channels where stars have been blown out and memory has settled like dust. In that vastness there are many names that sound like thunder or like lullabies. The God Emperor who watches and commands, the Adeptus Mechanicus, who speaks to metal like it were a temple, the low, pervasive prayer of the common world. There are wars that roll like storms and laws that shine like knives. And through it all, through the liturgy and the slaughter, there are those whose duty is older than their screams. The Space Marines, superhuman sentinels made in the image of war, each chapter a different hymn. Among them, one name moves like a shadow through other names, a line whispered in abbeys and shouted in the cracks of fortress monasteries. The Dark Angels. It is a name that carries weight, not only of martial prowess or of honors won in fire, but of silence. They are called many things in the dry annals of the Adeptus, lion-hearted, inexorable, remorseless in the face of enemies. But even those records lower their voices when the story reaches the parts that burn. We begin, gently, with what the records will say, and we will let the hush do the rest. They are the Emperor's firstborn sons. A phrase like that sits in the mouth like warm bread, simple, sustaining, and wood-sweet with reverence. Firstborn implies a kind of primacy, a closeness to the origin of things. It suggests the first dawn, the first light across a field. And yet with that firstness comes another burden, one that does not sing like victory but waits like a shadow at the edge of the hearth. For to be first is also to remember the fall that came earliest, to hold in the ribs of your history the first era, the first stain. They are the Emperor's firstborn sons, and the first to bear the weight of a sin so great, none dare speak it aloud. Picture, if you can, the rock. Imagine a monastery larger than 100 cities, its spires and buttresses and catacombs welded into a shape like a world, an arc of stone and alloy adrift in a sea of cold. The rock does not fly like a sleek cruiser. It moves with the unstoppable patience of a glacier, its bulk threaded by corridors that can swallow a man's voice whole, by halls where torchlight seems too flimsy to keep the gloom at bay. Outside, the void is a canvas of star needles. Inside, the rock keeps its combustions and its prayers, its engines humming a low, constant tone that threads through every carved chamber like a heartbeat. In some bright explanations, it is called a fortress monastery, a place of sanctity and of war, of relics and of armories. In truth, it is more like a city of vows, a place where oaths are made and unmade beside altars of honed steel. There are quarters of living stone where the chapter's brethren sleep beneath banners and the eyes of carved angels. There are vaults where armor sleeps, row upon row, each suit breathing faintly with its servos and its maintenance wards. And there are the places that are kept deliberately darker, stairwells that twist like the inside of a shell, doors that seal with a click that sounds like finality. These doors are not all mechanical. Some are keyed to memory and guilt, and a vow that will not be forgiven. They are locked doors that none may open. They are doors that keep more than rusted machines behind them. The first sounds you will notice, if you allow your mind to rest inside the rock for a while, are small and domestic. The whisper of robes, the soft clink of gauntlets laid upon polished stone, the distant chime of an augury bell. Then under those comes the mechanical music. A rhythmic huff of servo-driven lungs, the quiet whirring of an artificer's contrivance, the slow torquing of ancient engines that hum in frequencies older than many languages. Lend your ear and you will hear chanting, not the fierce shouts of battle, but a low, continuous litany that runs through the chapters like a river. It is a chant of names, of oaths, of remembrance. Names spoken not to be heard, but to be remembered. Names offered like a steady incense. The sound is soothing. It is meant to soothe, to order, to keep the mind steady as knives do not clatter, and the endless machine of war does not grind the soul to dust. That chant has a cadence. It rises and falls like a tide, and in its dips are the spaces where thought may wander. In those spaces, the mind of a listener, a new apprentice, an old veteran, perhaps you stretched on a pallet in a tiny cell beneath the library, may begin to perceive the notion of what is withheld. There are hushed names unspoken, phrases that are tasted like the fold of a letter but never read aloud. The chapter keeps a ledger of omission, for every victory a silence, for every sainted deed a locked confession. This is their way of keeping the world safe from what they hide, or of keeping themselves safe from what they fear. It is hard to tell which. The majesty of the rock is not only in its scale, but in how it encloses these contradictions. Outside, cannon fire bangs and nebulae glow like bruises. Inside, the rock holds an entire litany of ceremony for a single bolt of the storm. There are cloisters stitched with stained glass that depict scenes of a distant past, a lion-like figure leading men into light, a broken banner half-shrouded. Those windows scatter a soft, colored darkness through halls that would otherwise be too gray to live in. There are statues that stand like guardians, their faces half hidden under hoods. Some have their hands folded, others clutch swords which have never been stained with the blood of the chapter. They look noble and they look ancient. They look like they have forgiven something terrible. It is easy, in a quiet hour, to believe they have forgiven it. It is easier still to repeat the official hymn. They are remnant of an age of heroes, custodians of sacred honor, tireless hunters of the enemies of the Imperium. The dark angels dispatch regiments across star systems for reasons both holy and strategic, and they do it with a silent, terrible efficiency. They move like fell statues, like the last liturgy against a world of ash. Their power armor breathes like living things, a slow, metallic respiration that hints at machines made to mimic the human chest. Listen to that breathing. There is warmth in it, a memory of blood beneath the ceramic, of men who once slept with mothers and cried like infants. Even now, beneath alloys and arcane sigils, something of that original humanity murmurs. And yet, beneath that memory of humanity, there is a hardness that was forged as much by guilt as by necessity. The Dark Angels are a people of ritual and severity. They do not celebrate triumph the way others might. Their feasts are brief, their revelry restrained. They pray in long, modular rites that take hours to complete. They treat confession as an instrument of cleansing rather than indulgence. Sometimes, in the emptied hours when oil and prayer mix in the air, a brother will stand before a chapel and set his gauntleted hand upon his breastplate and say, without emphasis, "I have seen." That phrase is both a blessing and a condemnation. To say, "I have seen," in the rock is to admit a vision that cannot be borne lightly. Who are the men behind the masks? They are sons of gene templating and of genetic engineering, raised from the marrow of legend into beings that measure distance and motive in a way a regular man cannot. They stride like pillars and strike with the efficiency of a historian striking out mistakes in a page. Yet when the light softens and the hum of engines becomes a cradle song, there is time for the old imagery to surface. The broken child who once cried out in a crib, the youth who took his first oath under a false sunrise. Inside power armor are sores of memory, and in the pauses between orders, their minds can still taste human things. The texture of bread, the warmth of an embrace, the ache of loneliness. The rock, in its magnificence, preserves those little memories as if they are contraband, smoothing them like trapped insects beneath a seal. There is also the matter of the fallen. The word arrives as a distant toll of a bell rather than a thrown object. It is a term that the chapter uses with a kind of clinical cruelty. The fallen are those who turned. They are the ones who, in a moment of weakness or of revelation, stepped away from the chapter's path and embraced something else. The stories of their betrayal are told in truncated fragments, like film strips with missing sections. Once in other ages, they walked shoulder to shoulder with the loyal. Once, their laughter matched the cadence of the ranks. Then they were lost, not only to treason, but to a metamorphosis that made them strangers, their colors and sigils twisted into mockeries of their origin. To speak of the fallen aloud in the great halls of the rock is to invite the old things to sweep in like storm tide. So the chapter speaks instead of searching. Hunt in the dark, fetch the lost, and return to the ascetic liturgy of atonement. The hunt is ritualized. It is not merely a matter of war but of penance. Each campaign they undertake is a step in a complicated liturgy meant to restore balance where there has been desecration. In the cold corridors of the rock, there are alcoves dedicated to those missions, small shrines where names are carved, dates written in languages that look simultaneously alien and intimate. At these shrines, the brethren stand in pairs and place their palms upon engraved stone, repeating, word by careful word, a formula that binds them to the memory of failure and to the duty of rectification. Hear the rhythm in their work. They prepare, they go forth, they enact punishment, and they return to the rock to lay their deeds like stones upon the pew. They speak the results in clipped sentences. The words are not celebratory. They are confessions in the public eye. It is a system of self-punishment hidden within the machinery of command. The rock doesn't just house warriors. It houses memory and the rituals that grind memory into a usable, if bitter, fuel. There are those among the brethren whose faces are kept cloaked even in prayer. These are the ones who have been given tasks that burrow away from light. They are interrogator chaplains, librarians, watchful sergeants whose words are as sharp as razor wind. Their duties are not always written in the bright verses of honor. Some open doors, others seal them. Some are charged to remember what others must forget. They move through the rock with the gait of men who know too much. They never look certain angles in the light because certainty implies a settling of dust, and dust can hide a confession. You may think the rock is impregnable, and for the most part it is. Its armor is thick as mountain bones, its armories deep as the sea. Yet even impregnable things contain fragile chambers. There are rooms under the rock into which few may step and even fewer may leave unchanged. There are locked doors that none may open without sanction. Doors whose seals are not made of bronze alone, but of vows, oaths, and the very memories of those who bound them. Keys to these doors are carved from guilt, fashioned in the kiln of regret. It is in those rooms that the most dangerous relics sleep. Artifacts that breathe and whisper, papers that still smell of iron and old blood, reliquaries that hum faintly when the machine bards pass too near. Keep your hand from them, some of the oldest voices say. Keep your hand from what remembers too well. Around these places the architecture bends as if to hide them from casual sight. Hallways will take the wanderer in circles until the wanderer's courage is spent. Lamps will go out for reasons that have nothing to do with power failures. A man will awake from a trance and find himself a day older, with no memory of where the time went. It is no small thing to say that the rock remembers. In certain ways it does, with the patience of a tumor or the meticulousness of a shrine keeper. It holds the past like coins in a pouch, clinking faintly when disturbed. And so, in the shadow of the machinery, in the whispered liturgies, in the locked rooms and the unspoken names, the dark angels keep faith with themselves, and with a past that is both a shield and a blade. They pray, they hunt, they atone. In their practiced calm there is, like under ice, a restless current. You can see it if you look for it. The quickening of a hand when a name is mentioned, the long pause before a brother says, "I have seen." It is a small thing, perhaps, to the unaccustomed ear, but it is how the true story of their firstness begins. They were first for a reason, not merely born of the emperor's will, but set near the hinge of time, where small decisions change the shape of days into years. That primacy made them guardians, made them custodians of the earliest light, and in guarding the light, they became its keepers and its jailers. In protecting the Imperium, they also shielded something darker from hungry sight. That is why the chapter's steps are quiet now, why their hymns have the tone of people who have learned to sound like sleep even when they remain awake. Listen closely, then, to the final cadence of this slow beginning. Let the hum of the engines settle in your chest like a lullaby. Feel the breathing of a warrior's armor as if it were your own. Know that in the hush there are doors and names and relics, and that some things are kept behind keys made of oath. Remember the phrase they do not say without trembling. They are the emperor's firstborn sons, and the first to bear the weight of a sin so great, none dare speak it aloud. So we close this hour as the rock keeps its vigil, turning imperceptibly through the cold. The chanting fades into the sound of distant engines, and the chapel candles gutter but do not die. Somewhere in the maze of corridors a brother whispers, "I have seen," and another answers with a touch, not a question. Outside, the stars roll on, uncaring and bright. Inside, the rock cradles its memory like an ember between two scales. There is a quiet dignity in that keeping. There is also a waiting. The gods of metal and oath attend. The past presses like a palm against the throat of the present. If you close your eyes now, you will not see the horrors next, not yet. For this is only the first evening, the slowest part of the descent. Let sleep take you with the rock's song, and in the wake of that sleep, perhaps you will wake to the sound of a distant, different bell, a bell that knows names no hymn dares recite. They were once many names and a single oath. They were legion, a flow of men braided into purpose, a tapestry of banners and banners folded into a single, long-suffering cloth. That was the first understanding of them, a people of dawn and iron, of morning prayers and the smell of hot metal. But time, as it always does, split the cloth. The Horus Heresy was a blade that severed brothers from brothers, and from the severed edges something new crawled and hardened. The chapter. This is not a technical history. It is not an oration of dates and strategic maneuvers. It is a quieter thing, a contemplation of becoming. A legion becomes a chapter the way a river becomes a canyon, through pressure, through erosion, through choices that set stones in place until they can only be undone by catastrophe. The Dark Angel's transformation was less a formal decree than a long, inexorable inward folding. It began with name, with ritual, with the slow substitution of silence for speech. Where once the legionnaires moved as one vast organism, sharing counsel, memory, even bloodlines, there grew a different architecture of loyalty. The aggregation of men into a monolithic force had space for voices. The chapter is a machine of roles. It compartmentalizes trust. Command is filtered through degrees of secrecy, and secrets become the seals that hold order together. The old things that were spoken openly, errors, doubts, private grief, were moved from halls into inner cells. They were bound in words of oath and vow, and then they were closed away. Thus loyalty shifted not just outward, toward the emperor's cause, but inward toward the chapter's own custody of truth. Silence took on a ritual aspect. Where laughter might once have been free, it became a curated gesture, brief at mess, strained at feast. The brothers learned to trim stories. They learned that to mention certain names might stir something like tide. In the beginning, these silences were practical. To prevent panic, to preserve morale, to maintain order. Over the centuries, they ossified into a theology of omission. The chapter began to worship absence. They enshrined not their saints as much as their prohibitions. Great halls were hung not with murals of heroic deeds, but with lists of forbidden acts and the names of those who must not be called. The more the chapter sought to hide, the more it assumed its own rationale. Secrecy became sanctity. Self-punishment flowered in the soil of that secrecy. It is one thing to deny an indulgence openly. It is another to construct a daily calculus of penance. The rituals of atonement are many and small. Extra drills done till dawn, prayers whispered into voids of stone, the cold application of sanctified oils to armor and flesh. Brothers would wake and mark themselves with ash in private, tracing runes of remembrance that none outside the inner circles would know to read. The chapter turned contrition into craft. They made the correction of self into a virtue as demanded as any campaign victory. In doing so, they created a people whose first reflex was to turn inward upon transgression and to measure themselves against a law whose margins were not written anywhere else, but in the contracted jaws of memory. It was not only ritual that marked the change, but the psychology beneath it. When a society of warriors decides that some knowledge must be sealed, the mind adapts. Cognitive space once used for curiosity and doubt is reallocated to vigilance and recall. The brothers trained themselves to notice the smallest deviations: a gait unsteady, a glance that lingered too long on a reliquary, a hand that twitched when a name was mentioned. These small observations fed the chapter's internal economy of guilt and atonement. They created, in the warp of everyday life, a web that could trap the unwary. It was not only punishment for betrayal they feared contamination of thought. Ideas, like contagions, could erode cohesion. So they learned to quarantine not just bodies but questions. From that habit of quarantine arose a system of roles specialized to hold what others could not. Interrogator chaplains emerged as sentinels of memory, men given the duty to hear what was dangerous and to record what must not be forgotten. Librarians, too, became more than keepers of lore. They were custodians of the mind itself, psychically aware and trained to read the undercurrents in a brother's soul. These figures moved like priests and surgeons in one body, part ministrant, part scalpel. They tended to the wounds of conscience and dissected the dangerous ideas that rotted at the fringes of loyalty. And then there are the fallen, a word that falls through air like a stone and makes a different sound depending on where it lands. The chapter did not invent the term. It existed before the chapter formed. But the dark angels pressed it into a theology of loss. The fallen were not merely deserters or traitors. In the softer histories, they are those who walked away from duty for reasons that sounded human: a grievance, an affection, a moment of doubt. In darker whispers, they were different beasts, figures who, in the crucible of the heresy, embraced an alien corrosion of will. They became grotesques of memory, mirrors looking back with the wrongness of gapped smiles and broken standards. The transformation from brothers to fallen was not always instant. It happened in hues, a hesitation here, an unspoken sympathy there. Sometimes a brother's family was threatened, and he answered with choices that considerations of duty did not sanction. Sometimes the gaze of a man lingered on a forbidden artifact, and slowly, like mold in a damp corner, something took hold. The heresy provided an environment for such corrosion. Under the pressures of civil war, sometimes loyalty fractured and men were faced with choices between the immediate survival of a few and the abstract promise of a later, larger victory. The dark angels remember such choices with a peculiar ache, because many of those decisions were made within ranks they themselves commanded. Thus, what might have been a line in an annal, a list of names of the fallen, became a living hunt. The chapter, which had once been a single organization tasked with war, took upon itself a different duty: to find their missing and bring order to what had been abandoned. They called it vindication. The hunt for the fallen was transformed into an act of faith, as much as a military campaign. The dark angels did not march only to conquer. They marched to gather their lost and to make amends, or at least to answer for where they had failed. That hunt is not a simple matter of conquest. The fallen are wily, and they do not always live in open exile. Many hid under garbs and altars, hiding their ancestry, changing their sigils to mock the old heraldry with twisted parodies. Others fell into deeper corruptions and became something else entirely, their minds and bodies altered by forces that wore the shapes of their old companions to lure them in. The tracking of such foes required a different art than simple battlefield tactics. It demanded patience, infiltration, clandestine confession. Interrogator chaplains became investigators, librarians, psychometric detectives. They would pore over the past, reading the shadows where a man's choices were written faintly in the gouges of his armor, or in the threads of his personal prayers. Amid all this, the chapter's tone shifted from the external valorization common to other chapters to an internalized austerity. They did not burn with the same joy at conquest. The taking of a world felt to them like the scratching of a callus, necessary, painful, and not something to be celebrated. Their hymns became shorter, their banners more severe. Even triumphal iconography turned inward. Instead of depicting victory in open theater, they depicted it as a recovery of lost things, a letter found, a name reconciled, a young acolyte brought back from the edge of temptation. Their victories were atonement. Psychologically, living in such a system is corrosive. The mind learns to anticipate guilt. The self-check becomes both sword and shield. Brothers will interrogate their thoughts as if to preempt the coup of betrayal. They learn to make confession not as release but as a prophylactic. In this climate, privacy is both a refuge and a hazard. A man can keep a thought hidden and thus be preserved or be possessed by it. The chapter, in its wisdom and its fear, mitigates that hazard by ritualizing confession. This is where the interrogator chaplains and the librarians perform their most delicate work, to pry without harm, to extract dangerous memories, and to bind them in safe forms that do not erode the mind. The imperative is surgical. Isolate dangerous ideas before they germinate. Yet even the most perfect system of observation cannot catch everything. There are always the margins where rumor grows, where a thing can be mistaken for another. And into those margins creep voices, faint, insistent, almost intimate. They are called whispers, and among the brethren they are given many names. Some call them the memory echoes, others use language more literal. They are the voices of the fallen, or perhaps the echo of the choices that led to falling. Sometimes they are the fragments of the hive mind of a battlefield. Sometimes they are something less definable, psychical ripples that pass through the fabric of those attuned to guilt. Our focus narrows, then, not to the chapter as an abstract, but to an individual whose life is the living site of such ripples. He is an interrogator chaplain by title and by duty, but in private he walks a narrower path. Among his brethren he is known for a face that is unreadable and for a voice that is ever measured. He keeps his rituals precisely. He writes his lists carefully. His name, even if you do not know it, could be given many times over in the litany of the chapter because there are many who do his work. But he has one particular susceptibility. He has begun to hear the whispers. They began as the kind of minor phenomenon that can be made small with a hard breath and a disciplined prayer. After long watches in the crypts, after interrogations that dig into memory like the roots of a tree, he would return to his cell with a name at the corner of his mind that did not belong to the day's confession. Or in the middle of a chant he'd catch a syllable that did not fit the litany, like a chord out of tune. He told himself these were the artifacts of fatigue. But whispers are patient creatures. They nestle into compartments of worry and feed. At first the whispers spoke of place and time, a detachment in a black sky system, a boy with a torn banner. The interrogator would check the archives and find a loose entry that matched. The whispers were useful in that sense. They revealed hidden corners where a fallen might have once sheltered. But usefulness becomes danger when the whispers begin to personalize. They begin to name things that cannot be in the records, feelings, private remembrances, intimate confessions. They would arrive in the middle of his prayers as soft insinuations, an almost forgotten childhood memory, the exact name of a woman he had once seen in a dream. The voice would not only tell him of the fallen, it would remind him of his own shadows. They said the whispers were echoes of history, he would mutter privately, fingers drifting over a rosary of iron. The line comforts him because it frames the intrusion as harmless. Echoes are images of what was spoken, not living rodents gnawing at the foundation. But there is a difference between an echo that returns a room's word and a whisper that knows the room's live occupants. For the whispers never simply mimic the past. They quote it in a way that suggests intention. They speak his private name in a lattice of vowels that the public rites do not use. Sometimes they smile with a memory that is not his but could have been. He does not admit this to others. The role of his office forbids it. Confession must be calibrated, not dramatized. Instead, he keeps a private ledger, a palimpsest of notes scrawled in careful hand. He writes down what the whispers tell him, and then he tries to trace them through the archives, seeing where coincidence yields to pattern. The more he writes, the less certain he becomes about where the whispers end and his own mind begins. That is the first danger. The second is that the whispers are, by design, persuasive. They sculpt doubt like a chisel. There are nights when he finds himself in the archives, sleeves rolled, candles guttering, with a single phrase repeating in his head. We were not the first to judge. The phrase is small, almost doctrinally meaningless until its weight shifts. What if the chamber of repentance, harsh, necessary, and secretive, had itself been a place of judgment too quick and too certain? What if, in the fog of heresy, mistakes had been made, and the stains called treason were sometimes the marks of tragedy or the necessity of a grievous choice? The whispers entice with such speculation, and speculation is dangerous in a society built upon certainty. The interrogator begins to experience the cognitive dissonance that comes when the instrument of authority recognizes its own fallibility. He has always measured others against a standard. Now he must measure the instrument itself. He finds, through his research and through the edges the whispers reveal, instances where the line between treachery and a tactical withdrawal blurs. He discovers names where the evidence is thin and judgment heavy. He feels the weight of each of these cases like a small pebble in his palm, and the whispers say, in a tone almost considerate, "If mistakes were made, what then of our retribution?" This is the insidiousness of the whispers. They do not command with the fierce clarity of seduction. They coax with the tone of a conspirator who shares a secret for companionship rather than dominion. They will not tell him to betray. They will offer him moral mirrors that reflect doubts and invite reevaluation. For a man whose faith is built on the binary of loyalty and betrayal, a mirror can be weapon. The interrogator begins to ask questions aloud in his solitude. What makes a crime a crime? Who ordained the agendas that condemn? Did we always punish the guilty? What if we punished the bereaved, the desperate, the confused? His colleagues notice minor changes. He lasts longer in the archives now. He speaks with more care in the chapel. He keeps his hands steepled more often, as if restraining a tremor. An old brother, granted the leniency of friendship, will sometimes find him staring into a cup of warm oil as if it held a future. "You walk too far under the stone roof," the brother will say, the phrase meaning both a literal warning and a chiding for melancholic devotion. The interrogator smiles and replies, "The stone keeps stories." He does not tell the brother that sometimes the stories answer back. These small changes are subtle, difficult to proscribe as aberrant behavior. The chapter's culture trains men to be stoics. A man who sits long in a library is less remarkable than one who moves long on a battlefield. Yet the pattern is there. And pattern, in a people who read patterns like scripture, becomes an item of interest. A junior librarian, keen-eyed and eager to be useful, will notice the interrogator's longer isolation and will bring up his observations in a controlled query. The interrogator is frank yet evasive. He will admit that the archives have yielded uncomfortable evidence, but will insist that work requires attention. He will not say that whisper voices have led him to consider unpopular interpretations of old transgressions. The librarian is not a tribunal. He is an observer and a keeper of mental cleanliness. He performs analytic rituals, psychic scans, empathy exercises, readings of the mind's seams. Under the lending light of a psychometrist, he will subject the interrogator to tests that are no more invasive than a ritualized touch. The interrogator tolerates this with the patience of one who knows that such measures preserve the chapter. Yet even the librarian is unsettled. In the hum of the machine, a faint resonance appears, like an overtones of a bell. It is not standard psychic noise. It resembles a layering of disparate mind prints, some old, some fresh. The whispers are not merely in the interrogator's head. They have a reach that can be detected. When the librarian reports this, the reaction among the senior counselors is a practiced flicker of the eyes and a lowering of voices. Such phenomena are not unheard of. The warp is a capricious ocean, and echoes travel strange waves. The chapter's response is to tighten discipline and to assign watchers, men who will sit opposite the interrogator through several vigils, noting the cadence of his breath and the trajectory of his walks. This is ritual again, the chapter's default mechanistic answer: observation, recording, containment. But containment is not cure. The whispers are patient and replicate in margins. They adapt their phrasing and their insinuations. They will place memories that the interrogator cannot verify, and then they will listen while he tries to make sense of them. They are a corrosive intelligence that works through empathy and self-doubt rather than through overt control. In the space of the interrogator's obligations, they fold in like mold into bread. The true test arrives not in the archive nor in the chapel, but in a mission field far from the rock, where the chapter must reclaim a village that had supposedly harbored a band of fallen. It is an ordinary sort of operation, the kind that has trained many a man. Secure the area, gather residents, interrogate, and apply justice according to the chapter's counsel. The interrogator accompanies the squad as an instrument of interrogation and conscience. He is careful. He is prepared to assert the chapter's will. Yet the whispers have taught him to listen differently. In the questions he asks, he hears echoes of his private ledger. When a woman weeps in front of him, claiming her husband had left for a neighboring system rather than taken treason, he pauses longer than protocol endorses. The squad captain, hardened, practical, casts him a narrow look when he delays a punishment to probe further. The man's hesitation is read as weakness. The whispers pulse like a beneath-the-skin drum. "Listen further," they murmur. "This is not only about law." The pause proves costly in a literal sense. The squad captain's impatience allows the fallen to slip away in the confusion. In a sense, the market of morality shifts. Protocols exist to prevent mercy from undermining order. The interrogator's decision to ask more questions appears to have given the fallen the chance to escape, and the squad bears a small but real defeat. When they return to the rock, the formalities of the chapter's ritual do not allow for an easy moral calculus. The interrogator is called before stern faces and the echo of his colleagues' measured words. He gives an account. He details what he saw and why he delayed. He speaks of hearsay and of thin evidence. He reads from the ledger he has kept, the notes of whispers and of possible misjudgments. The senior counselors listen. For a time the air is as still as a sealed crypt. Then they speak, in the voice the chapter gives to final things. Cool, precise, without indulgence. They point to the principle, the cost of hesitation. They remind him that their method has produced a history of fewer betrayals, of fewer slippages. They commend his compassion but admonish his result. He is reprimanded in the least humiliating mode the chapter allows: formal correction, minor curtailment of duty, increased oversight. It would be easy to say that this chastisement resolves him, that the interrogator returns to his previous posture and the whispers recede. It is not so simple. The reprimand seeds another thought. Systems that must execute with certainty are the ones least likely to notice their own errors. The whispers, which had begun as suggestions, now seem like vitals that transmit warnings. Who, he begins to wonder, polices the police? If the chapter's sacred mechanisms assume infallibility, what becomes of mercy? If a man is punished for the appearance of treachery alone, what then is justice? The tale proceeds along the narrow and precarious spine of that question. The chapter, anchored in rituals of silence and punishment, continues to act with the serene efficiency expected of it. Campaigns proceed, penances are enacted, fallen are tracked and tested. Yet in the margins a new narrative grows, one of a man who will not easily forget the taste of doubt. The whispers remain with him like a second breath. They show him patches in the chapter's past where verdicts were swift and evidence thin. They whisper of the night when a captain acted on rumor, and a family burned rather than being saved. The interrogator's conscience keeps these stories like embers, and sometimes relights them until they glow hot enough to be seen. This is not a nefarious descent. It is not a conversion to heresy or sedition. It is an evolution of perception colored by the persistent presence of the fallen's voices. The interrogator does not call the fallen sympathetic. He sees their acts as catastrophic, yet he cannot help but consider context. He recognizes the grotesque reality that sometimes men are judged by teams whose instruments do not measure nuance. He wonders if perhaps the chapter's architecture of secrecy, designed to protect the whole, may have inflicted an injustice on individuals. And in that unsettled space, the whispers gain volume. They do not promise power or ease. They promise understanding. For the interrogator, it is a terrible promise, like a man offered a map to a wound that cannot be healed. He seeks not redemption for the fallen. There is no comfortable absolution, but truth. He wants to know whether their fury is merely rage against a world that judged them too quickly, or whether it is an infection of will that must be excised. He moves, then, like a surgeon with a shaky hand, with precision, with apology for his own bias, and with the knowledge that any mistake now will be costlier than before. The chapter holds its rituals, the rock turns in its slow arc, and the brothers continue to do what they were bred for. To protect an Imperium that never sleeps, to hunt enemies that never end. Yet the interrogator's internal slow-burning question, narrow, stubborn, human, persists. He cannot unhear the phrase that caught in his throat months ago, the phrase the whispers rehearse like a litany. They said the whispers were echoes of history, but history does not whisper your name. That recognition, simple and precise, is the hinge on which the rest of the tale will swing. It is not the overthrow of faith. It is the fragile insertion of doubt. And doubt, once present in a system whose sinews are secrecy and penance, has a way of multiplying until it demands action. What will he do with it? Will he fold it into the chapter's existing rituals, another litany to be recited in stone? Will he burn it as heresy and seal it away like a plague? Or will the whispers, patient and precise, pull him deeper until the chapter itself begins to hear them in the places it has locked tight? For now, in this hour, they remain a man's problem and a small ripple on the vast ocean of the dark angels. The chapter grinds on. The rock keeps its vigil. The banners still fall and rise with the same disciplined wind. But beneath their calm, the small, dangerous questions have taken up residence. They will not be silenced by ceremony alone. They will demand evidence. They will demand examination. The interrogator prepares in his careful, methodical way to look where the chapter seldom looks, into its own ledger, into its own decisions. A soldier's prayer is often a simple thing. It asks for strength, for guidance, for the right hand in the fight. A man who becomes an interrogator prays for clarity and the endurance to hold truth without breaking. Our interrogator prays now in the stillness of a chapel whose candles burn like small suns. His lips move. The phrases are those learnt in youth and hardened in time. But under the words an echo persists, a curled thread in a tapestry. The whispers are not extinguished. They are patient. They have seen centuries. They know that the chapter lives by cycles: hunt, confess, seal. They are not frantic to destroy. They would rather be listened to. In the cool of the rock's cloisters, the interrogator places his hand upon his breast and feels the slow, metallic thrum of his armor's heart. The machine breathes, a steady reminder of what he is, crafted and chosen, a guardian of oaths. And still, beneath that crafted clarity, the human chord hums. He closes his eyes and hears the whisper again, almost tender this time. We were not the only ones who had to make a choice. It is not an accusation as much as a reminder. It is a small, mortally human thing. The chapter hears such remembrances only when men like him begin to listen. For now he listens, and that act, simple, defiant, and perhaps foolish, is the seed of change. He will take the whisper into the archives and into the vigil halls, into the hands of men who will either chisel it into doctrine or burn it as heresy. The outcome is not yet written, but the presence of doubt in a people founded on silence is an event. It is the first step of something that may remain a lone footnote or become an upheaval. We end this chapter not with resolution, but with the sense that an interior current has begun. The dark angels continue their duty with the same grim efficiency. Their banners still march across dead planets and lonely systems. Their engines still hum through the void. Yet something in the architecture of their silence has shifted. A man who should not have questions has them, and those questions are not merely personal. They ask of the chapter itself whether the cost of the sin they cover is worth the immensity of the secrecy they keep. The answer will not be polite nor simple. It will be argued in shadows and in the careful records of men who write with clean, precise hands. They said the whispers were echoes of history, but history does not whisper your name. History is printed and public. Whispers are intimate. When whispers know you, you are no longer a distant chronicle, you are implicated. And implication carries consequence. Listen, then, to the quiet. Listen to the slow turning of the rock and to the methodical breathing of armor. Above all, listen to the sound between the lines, a whisper becoming a voice, a single man's doubt that may yet teach an entire chapter to listen. They told me, in the long, careful way men of our order speak of things that must not yet be named, that the rock keeps its memories like a patient beast keeps a bone. It is a useful image. Stone as stomach, corridors as intestines, vaults as the dark bulk of memory sacks pressed against one another. But the truth is more intimate and less tidy. The rock remembers with 1,000 small things, a shiver in a banister, the corrosion of a hinge, the way light pools in one place and does not in another. Memory here is not a ledger. It is a habit long practiced until habit becomes instinct, and instinct can be a dangerous master. The first signs were what the elders call settling. That word is meant to sound benign. Things find their place. Dust commences, pipes quiet, engines slow. But settling in the rock is not merely gravity arranging matter. It is a slow rearrangement of sense. Lamps sputter in a pattern that is not random. The hum of servos lowers in a chord like a throat clearing. Men who have walked the same hall for decades feel a hair-raising offness and call it intuition. They will smile and say the rock is speaking. They will use that phrase with humor, then move on. But humor is easy when the voice of the house is cozy. Less easy when it begins to cough. Lights began to gutter in the lower galleries, at first single bulbs, then strings, then whole arches of illumination. Not all failures were electrical. Some lamps went out in the middle of a hand's reach, as if a cold palm had closed around their glow. Craftsmen came and adjusted filaments and rewired circuits, their instruments read clean. When asked, the mechanisms would not lie. Conduits were intact, capacitors within tolerance. Yet the lights responded as if a will had asked them not to burn. They blinked out like the eyelids of a tired god. Along with the failing light came the small rustlings that a disciplined mind at first calls settling. And then, when it increases in volume and pattern, signs. Panels shifted by mere millimeters. Screws turned under no hand. Puddles formed where pipes had long been dry, oily and dark as earthen wells. The engineers swore by their calibration that there was no breach, yet the fluids persisted, gathering as if to be heard. Machinery groaned in low intervals, a kind of metallic respiration that vibrated through soles and prosthetics and bone. It was not the purposeful motion of equipment designed for war. It was a slow complaint, like the long exhale of something with age and regret. It is important to say, and to say gently, that not all such phenomena are ominous in origin. Wear happens. Metal fatigues. Centuries of heat and cold ache the same way a man's knees do. But the rock's complaints were not those of simple wear. They held pattern and intention. They struck cadence. When a heavy plate slides an inch in the dead of a watch, that plate may have been moved by warped metal or by 1,000 tiny contractions. When a dozen plates all slide to the same note, when the sound of a bolt turning somewhere under your feet resembles the cadence of a voice you once heard in a dream, then the mathematics changes. The world of chance becomes the world of meaning. In the nights after the lights began, men reported small hallucinations, the kind that begin simply. An extra shadow in the corner of the eye, the sense of being followed by movement that vanishes when confronted. The interrogator noticed them as a slow drumbeat against the skin of his duties. He was not a man given to flights of the imagination. His life was paper, an inquiry and calibrated confession. Yet even he could not help the way his chest tightened when he rounded certain thresholds, nor the way his fingers would clench on a railing as if to catch something invisible. And dreams came as well. The interrogator's sleep, once a shallow, functional respite, grew dense with images that were not his to own. He dreamed of angels, not the serene, heraldic beings of the chapter's iconography, but angels whose wings were stitched and snapped, like paper fans drenched in oil. In one dream, the angels walked the cloisters with their heads bowed, their feathers clogged with soot and rust. Where feathers had once caught the light now stuck together and fell away in clumps. Their faces were young and old at once, pallid as bone and warm like living skin. They tried to speak, but when they opened their mouths, only the sound of a machine clicked out, gears grinding in syllables that might have been words if a man were to translate noise into meaning. The interrogator would awaken with his hands over his mouth, the taste of oil and incense thick on his tongue. There is a rhythm to the rock's nightmares. It is not wholly the interrogator's. Others dream things of their own. The standard-bearer dreams the banner rotting into a field of blackened hands. A novice sees the chapel doors open onto a sky of teeth. Dreams in a place like the Rock are contagious insofar as a culture shares symbols. They are not identical transmissions, but there is a particular vowel that keeps surfacing in the lower strata of cognition. The sound of a name called in a room of clocks. The interrogator tries to catch that name, to pin it like an insect on a slab. The name dissolves when he reaches for it, but it leaves a residue, the sense that something is persistent, a presence that will not be satisfied with being merely a memory. Physical signs followed. Angels sculpted in stone wept with an oil that smelled faintly of incense and old iron. At first the brothers thought the leaking was a chemical reaction, pigments decaying, adhesives weeping under centuries of stress. Conservationists employed by the chapter tested the residue and found it peculiar, a compound that did not fit any known formula, 1 part wax, 1 part petroleum derivative, and a sheen of old blood in its refractive index. They wiped away the effluent with solemn cloth and recoated the surface. The statues stopped weeping for a night and then began once more, each time in a different face and with a different pattern. The oil puddled in the grooves of stony robes like tears pooled in the hollows of real flesh. Blood appeared as well, though less often and in smaller, more cryptic ways. It would be a smear on an altar that no one recalled using that week. It would be a single drop on a stair where no one had bled. It smelled of incense because incense is the language of altars in the Rock. Everything is liturgical here, and scent is a syntax. Men who encountered these stains felt, at first, a professional duty to record and sanitize. After that, in private rooms with low light, with their gauntleted hands removed and their faces slack, they felt a slow, almost illicit awe. It is disquieting to be watched by a place built to watch others. Sound design, the rhythmic ecology of the Rock, recalibrated around these anomalies. The normal chorus of industry and prayer gave place to something more insistent. Drips, rhythmic and irregular, became a percussion that threaded through the halls. Water and oil and something else, perhaps the sweating of old organisms, perhaps the leakage of memory. The drip is a particular kind of terror because it measures time. Each drop falls and registers, and the accumulation becomes a metronome for waiting. The interrogator realized he could count his nights not only by candles burnt, but by the staccato of droplets in a room he rarely entered. Vox static arrived in patches, always on frequencies that seemed to be the leftovers of dead channels, the kind of background noise that the chapter keeps for ritual effect. The static was not silent. It contained a repetition, a ghostly reverberation of a single command or benediction. Over and over, through the hiss of circuits and the slow churn of the rock's engines, a word would sharpen, blunted by interference but crisp enough to be caught. Repent. The word did not project like a sermon. It hissed, a sibilant insistence in the bone behind a man's ears. It invaded dreams and moments of prayer, a worm of language burrowing into silence. The interrogator found himself tuning instruments to capture the static. They were crude measures, loops of temporal capture that could be set in vaults to record ambient output for later review. Much of what they captured was routine noise, the static of long wires and archaic vox bands. But in certain recordings, the hiss revealed something like rhythm, a syllabic pattern in the interference that matched the cadence of chanting used in penitential rites. And then, at times, a corruption of that cadence into a phrase that sounded faintly like the naming of a man. To hear your own or someone else's name echo in static is a small seizure. It causes all the hairs to stand up as if the soul were attempting to peek through the skin. And there was a rising sensation, subtle yet unignorable, of being observed. It is not merely the cultural paranoia that accrues in any closed martial society. It is a different quality. The architecture itself seems to hold its gaze. Hallways narrow as if to funnel the eye toward a focal point that drifts at the periphery. Statues are positioned in such a way that they watch one another's backs. Mirrors are rare. The rock prefers reflection confined to polished armor rather than the vanity of glass. Even the floor tiling sometimes arranges into patterns that direct movement along certain lines, as though an unseen hand were arranging pilgrims. The interrogator began to feel the sensation with an animal certainty. Something in the rock's walls had shifted from passive containment to active attention. He took to walking at odd hours, to patrol corridors whose ends seemed to end in nothing. He would bring a flicker lantern and let its small wash of light reveal the contours of tapestries and the thin film of oil that gathered in corners. Often nothing would be found. Sometimes the lantern would illuminate a scrap, a fragment of a banner with a sigil half erased, or a child's toy that could belong to no one in particular, and yet memorialized grief in its very absence. Once he found a lock of hair trapped beneath a flagstone, none of it belonging to any living member in the rock's registry. These discoveries would be logged as evidence, filed and sealed. But the logs themselves increased the sense that the building required tending not just of its parts, but of its conscience. Symbolism grew in the place like a fungus, analogies made literal by centuries of ritual and by minds attuned to pattern. The interrogator walked past a statue of a winged man who once held a sword aloft. Now the sword lay at his feet and his wings hung like cloth strips, stained dark where feathers should have been. Oil glistened in the statue's carved eyes. The smell of incense threaded through the corridor, and beneath it, something iron-wet and old. In the library, he found marginal notes in a chronicler's hand that compared the stained statues to saints who had died, not in battle but in sorrow. Marginalia is a dangerous thing. It tends to conspire with dreams. Sometimes doors sealed themselves. This horror is practical and intimate at once. A portal closed with no hand upon the latch can be explained by machinery, a deadbolt engaged by old limits. A door that seals on a man when he stands in its frame, that shuts out light precisely when he looks to the world, is different. There were corridors where the companions reported that, though they had passed freely before, doors would click closed behind them and not open until another, unrelated ritual had been performed. In one instance, a cell door remained sealed for a man who had not yet confessed a crime, and the light within dimmed to the hue of late dusk. He emerged pale and reticent and spoke of a voice that had told him something in the dark he would not say even under oath. Doors that lock themselves are not merely obstruction, they are judgment enacted by walls. It is important at this point to return to the interrogator's inner state. He is not a man losing his grip by small haunting. He is a man whose job is to hold the grip on other people's minds. The creeping phenomena unsettled him because they threatened the very machinery by which order is maintained. There is a professional indignity to being made suspect by a building. He began to catalog the anomalies in the ledger in the margins, then in his personal notes. He would sit in the small scriptorium, candlelight painting his face in careful strokes, and write long sentences about small events. The time a statue's oil dripped in a pattern like a name. The way a vox static repeated a cadence with a slight inflection. The dream where an angel's wing flapped once softly, and the sound was like a child's sob. He also began to hear voices in a new register. Not the whispers that first led him into doubt, but a chorus that took the texture of authority and made of it a question. In those moments, the rock itself felt as if it were calling him forward. It did not call in words. It suggested in sensations. A warmth on the chest, a pressure behind the skull, an inclination of the knees. Rooms would tilt, not in a physical way but in a schematic pull. "Come here," they seemed to say. The interrogator resisted. He measured his steps, checked his instruments, and took other men's testimonies as sovereign. Yet the pull continued. The more he resisted, the more certain the rock seemed of its own narrative. Banners that had hung for generations were found to be in different places the next day. A reliquary opened by no logical means would contain an object not catalogued before, an icon with a face carved in a style that suggested an unfamiliar hand. These changes were small, and a careful mind could architect explanations for each. But patterns have gravity. The more of them that accumulate, the more improbable their total becomes. Probability begins to look like intent, and in the middle of this accrual of oddities, a phrase began to recur with the frequency of a prophecy in the static and in the drip and in the dream chant. "Repent." The vox channels repeated it. The statues seemed to tilt their heads as if the word had weight physically perceptible. In the chapel, the hymnals, if open to a certain page, sometimes contained a margin note seemingly added by a hand that had not written in that book for a century. Repent. The word became a metronome for nights. It was a call, yes, but to what? To confession alone, to something else. The ambiguity made it more terrifying. "They tell me the walls remember," the interrogator wrote one night with a looseness in his script that betrayed the strain of sleep deprivation. The sentence was no longer a metaphor to him. It was a thesis. That if I listen long enough, I will hear the screams of the fallen still repenting, still alive. He had the audacity, if such a thing can be called audacity, where the idea of caution is the first commandment, to believe the voices in a way that read history differently. He did not imagine the fallen as a chorus of revenants. He imagined them as voices that had embedded themselves in a place built to house oaths, and that would not be content until those oaths were heard and perhaps rewritten. This belief changed the tenor of his work. He moved from archival interrogation to a kind of empirical listening. He sat in rooms with recording devices and let the static play through a night. He took to sleeping in certain galleries, deliberately exposing himself to the rock's subtleties, as if by witnessing he could both catalog and contain the phenomena. It was a dangerous practice. It left him vulnerable, yet it also yielded data. The recordings showed minute shifts in cadence and occasional tones that, when slowed, resolved into distorted sibilants that could almost be parsed into phrases. The slow playback of a night's static would occasionally yield a flash that, when compared to the ledger, matched the day on which a certain retainer had been condemned. The implication was direct. The rock remembered more than events. It remembered verdicts. In the end, the interrogator realized that the rock's memory might not be a mere repository of accounts, but a mechanism of moral pressure. The building, through its patterning of lights and locks and leaks, might be remonstrating. It might be asking its custodians to reckon. Whether this remonstration was inspired by sorrow or by malignity he could not say. That uncertainty was the knife that cut him. Men of his office lived by edges. They do not like to be cut on them. The whispers under the rock kept at him, patient and increasing. They were not malicious in the traditional tale sense. They were entreaty and accusation braided. Listen, they seemed to say, to the drip, the static, the oil-stained statues. Listen to the doors that will not open until certain names are spoken. Listen to the way banners move when no wind is present. The interrogator listened because his trade required it. He discovered small truths in that listening, overlooked verdicts, names removed from rosters with no annotation, correspondence burned and reconstructed from memory fragments. Each small discovery was a pebble thrown in a quiet pond. Their ripples reached councils and chaplains and the librarians. Some creatures in the rock did not like ripples, and that is when the watching became more explicit. Men who had once overlooked the interrogator's late hours began to glance at him not with casual curiosity, but with a thin, measured caution. He was not yet suspect of subversion. He had not yet committed permanent heresy. He had, however, become an aperture through which a dangerous light might pass. The chapter, pragmatic as always, increased observational rituals. The watchers were not cruel, they were precise. Their presence was meant to contain him, to ensure that his listening would not turn into contagion. The rock, however, does not cede its moods to oversight. In certain nights, when candles tilted and the drip kept time, the interrogator would hear, as plainly as a man hears the creak of an old door, the voice of the fallen. It was not the full-bodied howling of a revenant. It was a whispering that was sometimes a name, sometimes a memory, sometimes a single syllable that cut across language. The sound of a man begging, the sound of a man forgiving, the sound of a man naming the thing that killed him. After such nights, the interrogator would stand in the chapel, palms pressed to the stone, and feel not relief, but the slow realization that the rock's memory might demand not simply acknowledgement, but unbinding. Men of the chapter will not unbind lightly. The mechanisms of secrecy have teeth of their own. Even the thought of opening certain doors causes the heart of governance to throb with alarm. Yet the rock had begun to suggest that some seals were not only for keeping things in, but for keeping something from moving on, as if confession were both a weapon and a chain. The interrogator, who had always believed order was preserved by deliberate denial, began to suspect that denial could calcify into cruelty. We leave him at the edge of a decision, neither guide nor judge, simply a man whose vocation has turned inward, who listens, who records, and who wrestles. Around him the rock groans, the drip keeps time, the oil on statues glints like old tears, and Vox Static repeats its single insistence. Repent. The word has become both invocation and accusation, and it is not yet clear which side of the balance it will fall on. They tell me the walls remember, that if I listen long enough I will hear the screams of the fallen still repenting, still alive. The interrogator listens. The rock watches. The whispers wait. He told me, with the soft, precise cadence of a confession, the thing no one meant for words. He told me the secret. It came to him in a time when the rock's own breathing seemed to shift, when the commonplace rhythms of metal and prayer slid like plates over one another and fit into new, uneasy patterns. The calm that had held the chapter like a careful hand began to crack, hairline fractures that ran deep beneath the stone. Where once he could walk corridors and count his steps, now the count would shift by one or two with no plausible arithmetic. Where once the hum of engines comforted like the distant pulse of a god, it now seemed to whisper names that belonged neither to saints nor to enemies, but to something between. The descent began with a summons that bore the weight of a liturgy. It was not a command that raised noise. It arrived as a unanimous lowering of voices, a folding in of routine. The interrogator was ordered, not with the bluntness of a combat command, but with the ritual gravity of an ecclesiastical fiat. To accompany a small retinue to a section of the rock no map would show on simple inspection. They were to go below the galleries and the armories, past the maintenance warrens and the sleeping halls, through the part of the monastery that had been folded in upon itself like a coin crushed to keep a secret inside. He prepared as if to attend the dead. Vestments scrubbed to a dull sheen, rosary of iron, a lantern whose wick sputtered but would not die. The retinue was smaller than the missions he had taken in the field. There were no squads of Marines, no squad carapaces, only a handful of brothers whose faces had the practiced neutrality of men who had watched too many things be closed. One of them, a librarian with a patch of gray in his hair though only middle-aged by chapter standards, kept his hand near the hilt of his forestaff, as if its presence would be protection enough. The rest wore the placid masks of obedience. The air changed as they moved deeper. It was not temperature alone but texture. The humidity thickened, not the kind of moisture that condenses from the void but something exhaled, as if the stone itself were breathing. The walls in the lower reaches had been cut in older hands, hammered and shaped in a time when artisans and priests overlapped. Their surface was not simply stone, it was a palimpsest. Carvings were overlaid with later sigils. Earlier coats of paint had been whitewashed and then scratched away with the careful claws of later caretakers. In some places the mortar had seedings, inlaid things that shivered in the lamplight, hairline threads of copper that looked for all the world like veins. At first it was only suggestion, the suggestion that the rock's architecture was less inert than they had been taught to assume. Then the suggestion became muscle. As they progressed, some panels yielded like skin. Metal plates, once bolted in place, slid as if on greased axles. Conduits below them hummed and then stilled, then hummed again with a variant note. The hums assembled into harmonics that the interrogator felt in his teeth. He tasted iron and old prayers. Somewhere behind them a gate clanged shut, and then the sound diffused, like something swallowing a bell. They reached the antechamber of the catacombs, and found it not empty, but arranged. Pillars were set like the ribs of some great beast that had been stretched and fossilized here. Central to the antechamber was an altar not used in any standard liturgy, a slab of obsidian smoothed to the shine of a mirror. Around it, encircling it like a ring of rites, were sarcophagi, not rows, not the ordered ranks of honored dead. These lay like a scatter of stones where each had been placed with care, and then sealed by hands that had more urgency than ceremony. The light of their lanterns picked out names incised on many lids. Some names were old and honored, others were scratched in haste. One lid held a sigil they had not seen in living time, the sigil of a company that had been cut from the rolls centuries before. The interrogator felt his throat tighten, not with fear at first, but with the tightness of recognition. The rock had been saving things in here. It had been keeping what men had assumed lost. The retinue moved slow as if in deference, touching the lids with fingertips that left prints like petitions. The librarian murmured a short litany and laid the edge of his staff against a sarcophagus in a gesture that might have been both invocation and instrument. There was a brief silence, and then a noise that they did not expect. A mechanical intake that was not the breath of the group but the breath of the chamber itself. It was a sound like the shuddering of a great lung, slow and measured, and when it exhaled the air smelled of guilt and old oil, and a faint, metallic tang that set teeth aching. At the center lay one sarcophagus whose lid was not wholly sealed. It was cracked like an egg that had not fully closed. Something inside shifted. It was the interrogator who perceived the movement first. A subtle flexing, the slow rebalancing of weight. He stepped forward, the lantern a small sun in his hand, and peered into the crack. What looked out at him was at once familiar and monstrous. The thing within the sarcophagus bore all the trappings of a space marine. Power armor, worn but intact. Sigils that had once signified honor. But where the plating had been smooth, there were blooms of corrosion that were not rust so much as graft. Organic tissue, grayed and shrunken, pushed at joints as if to claim them. In places where the ceramite shell had broken away, there was the suggestion of bone that had been machined. Ribs whose edges were too straight, marrow threaded with filament. A face looked out, or pretended to. Skin had been pulled over servoplating. Eyes were a combination of cataract and lens, pupils glinting with a light that might have been soul or might have been optics gone wrong. The interrogator felt his mouth dry. It is one thing to read about the fallen and another to see the mixture of flesh and machine attempting to constitute a human face. The chapter had taught him the taxonomy of monsters, those who had left and those who had remained. The fallen had twisted themselves to alien ends in some accounts, others implied they had become more. This thing, this ruinous synthesis, was a witness to neither simple category. The librarian stepped forward and placed his staff upon the sarcophagus, and did something the interrogator had not expected. He spoke, not a benediction but a query. The words were old and precise, cobbled from legalities of ritual and rites. Name and date, warrant of seal. The answer bled out not in words but in a noise that might have been a croak or might have been language trapped behind a throat of gears. The sarcophagus responded by exhaling a little plume of vapor that coalesced, then dissipated, leaving behind the sense of breath directed in their faces. The thing inside shifted, and with an effort more like a mechanical recalibration than a human action, pushed the lid open another inch. It spoke then, not with a voice as such, but through the static of its own failing vox. The sound carried a timbre that suggested voices layered, one senior and hoarse, another bright like a child's. Overlaid, these voices produced a melody that made the hairs on the interrogator's arms stand erect. The words were slurred by damage and by time, but there was enough articulation for one phrase to stumble through. A confession, a name, and then a question asked as if to a mirror. Who condemned me? Who wrote the seal? The retinue tensed. The librarian's fingers tightened on his staff. The interrogator felt a strange sympathy, not for the thing's plight, but for the human fragment that persisted within. Somewhere in the mix of hardware and tissue was the ghost of a man who might once have been a brother. The interrogator's training urged him to record the utterance, to log and to bind. The whispers in the stone, the ones that had first led him down this shadowed path, hummed in the corners of his mind as if to say, "Listen, this is the place where the ledger bleeds." They pried the lid further. The sarcophagus yielded with a grinding that sounded like bone and bolt negotiating. Inside, strapped and fused into a harness, lay the fallen, or a thing that wore the fallen like a suit. The armor had been reworked from within. Serval plating driven into cartilage, wire grafted to tendon, optic fibers threaded into the eye sockets as like intravenous grafts. The more the interrogator looked, the more he saw how the man had become machine, and the machine had become man. The boundary between metal and flesh had been smoothed away as if by heat, and then the thing spoke with more clarity, memories peeling like age-softened paint. It recited places and dates and names with a specificity that suggested ledger-keeping in itself. Detachments in the sable reach, the name of a lieutenant who had refused command, a night when a world burned for want of relief. When the interrogator's mind tried to recall that lieutenant, the memory felt slippery. It did not sit squarely in official rosters. The thing inside the sarcophagus seemed to know this and smiled, a motion that was more a twitch in servo joints than human. They judged us, it said. They made the law and then sealed it. They wrote us fallen and cast us out, but I did not leave. I am here. The confession was an oddity. The fallen, by the chapter's account, had been those who left their oaths and embraced other masters. They had fled or been banished. But here was a testament from a body that had never left. It had been locked away. It had been incorporated into the rock as a thing of both memory and horror. The interrogator felt the contours of a thought form beneath his skin. What if the mark of treason was not only for those who had left, but had been stamped also on those who had been judged, and then stored away? It is a narrow thing to say that judgment can be violent without being accurate. The chapter's systems were designed to enforce doctrine, because doctrine, in conflict, is survival. But the sarcophagus suggested something else. It suggested that the chapter had sometimes sealed its own children, as if to cure them of doubt by incarceration, not to allow them paths to repentance, but to render them inert. The rock, in that case, was less a protector than a warder. The fallen in the sarcophagus reached out then, more attesting of systems than the stretch of a living hand, and the interrogator felt his gauntlet under the press of an isolated force. A brush of recognition like the friction you feel when you remember the face of a friend in a crowd. The touch sparked, not in comfort but in accusation, as if the body itself indicted those who had left it there. For a moment the retinue wavered. The librarian's face went pale. In the gloom of that chamber, the retinue had come to bear witness. They had expected relic. They found an argument. The fallen thing began to speak more, and its speech gathered a quality that was not wholly of memory. It had a logic and a horror both. It narrated events in which the chapter itself had been the arbiter and the executioner. It recounted how, in the aftermath of the heresy, decisions had been made in the dry corridors of the rock to remove certain brothers from the rolls. It told of trials that had been conducted not under full light, but in the folded hours, of verdicts that had been more about preserving a narrative than about measuring truth. It did not cast itself entirely as innocent. It confessed to sins, to anger, to moments of violent rebellion. But between those confessions it placed others, mundane choices that had been twisted into felony for the convenience of victors. The more it spoke, the more the interrogator felt the texture of a pattern emerge. A line that connected the monstrous grafting of machine and body with a particular kind of institutional cowardice. As the testimony unfolded, walls around them seemed to answer. The very stone of the rock vibrated, low and reverent. The machineries embedded in the architecture, ancient servo spirits and dormant analog engines, woke not in a mechanical flicker but in recognition. The hums they produced were closer now to a chorus than a drone. The interrogator found his ears filled with a layering of sounds, the mechanical aside of gears, the low echo of chanting from somewhere distant, the drip of fluids in a rhythm that matched the cadence of the tale being told. It felt as if the rock itself had been listening to this sarcophagus for a long time and now could not help but join in. Then came a shift in tone that was not wholly the fallen's nor the rock's but a marriage of the two. Intention. The machinery around them, cables, conduits, the underlife of engines, answered the story with a pattern of motion. Panels slithered open like lips. A particular conduit exhaled vapor that took the shape of glyphs in the lamplight. Letters that the interrogator could not name but that felt like signatures. It was a language of infrastructure and oath, the rock writing back in its own medium, steel and oil, and its own internal voice. If the ruins in the sarcophagus spoke of institutional failure, the rock seemed to say, in the only way it knew how, that it had been complicit. He felt then, with the piercing clarity that sometimes attends horror, when an old, abiding truth is revealed and your body must accept it, that what the chapter had thought of as the fallen and the loyal had been an oversimplification. Some had left and been lost to corruption. Some had stayed and been punished by absence, their names erased, their existences placed in the rock's belly to be catalogued and then studied as specimen. The true mutation lay there, not only the corruption of those who embraced new masters, but the corruption of an institution that turned mercy into imprisonment. The machine spirit of the rock, that ancient and often metaphorical idea the Adeptus used to explain the moods of engines, made itself known then as something more than metaphor, not in the dramatic way of a wrathful god flinging hammers, but as a patient sentience that had gathered the accretions of centuries and learned to speak in the dialects of men. Its voice, if voice can be used, did not come as a single proclamation, but as an arrangement of symbols, smells, and gestures that matched the subject of the fallen's confession. It was hungry, but not for flesh alone, hungry for integrity, for the truth that would unstop breaks and open sealed doors. Hunger, in the rock, could be a kind of moral appetite. It wanted to be cleared of the rot that came from lies told to keep order. The retinue did not all agree on what to do. The librarian argued that the evidence was corrupted by time and the politics of pain. He suggested careful exegesis, a slow read of the accounts with the machinery logged for future scrutiny. Others, more fearful, insisted the sarcophagus be sealed and further questioned only by the council. The interrogator chose a third path. He listened. He allowed the fallen thing to speak in long, unbroken sequences, and he recorded them with the care of a man who knew the danger of definitive pronunciations. The fallibility they had discovered posed a question that was more a blade than a tool. Could a people founded on secrecy and the management of sin be trusted to judge its own? The sarcophagus's voice, with its mix of pain and accusation, suggested not just error but a structural decision to conceal. The rock, whose engines had been a friend in war and a father in keeping oaths, had stilled some of its own children not simply to protect the Imperium, but to protect the chapter's narrative. Mercy here had been handled as if it were contraband, dangerous, contagious, to be sealed away. As the chamber hummed and the sarcophagus recited, the interrogator heard, under all the voice and movement, a quieter revelation. The true fallen were not only those who fled to other allegiances. They were also the ones whose identity had been erased by an institution that feared the weakness of doubt. They had been punished for the very human act of hesitating, of making tragic choices under impossible pressures. Their bodies, withered, grafted, mummified against the corrosion of time, were now arguments lodged within the rock's anatomy. The rock had eaten them, and in eating them it had kept something alive it did not understand. It is a destabilizing thing to recognize that your sanctuaries may be prisons. The interrogator felt his ground shift. He had once believed his authority sprang from a clean line of duty. Now he saw that some of those lines were drawn with blood and then erased. He also recognized the danger of this knowledge. Revelation in a culture like the Dark Angels is a match in a powder room, carefully controlled until an accident sets it alight. He could keep the knowledge, bury it in careful codices and marginalia. He could bring it to the council. He could also do nothing and let age and entropy claim these skeletons. Before he could choose, the sarcophagus's thing offered another image. Not so much words now, but a picture that sank into his mind like a nail. It showed in flickers the hall where verdicts were given, the faces of men whose lips had been sealed, the hands that had written the seals, the remorses that had been washed away by ceremony. Then the image shifted, and he saw not only the accused but the accusers in their own cages. Men who had made decisions and had to live with them, who housed within themselves a rot of guilt masked by ritual. "We did not leave," the fallen voice said, "because we had nowhere to go that would keep the truth. The mark of treason became a bridle to keep the story tidy. Those who stayed were bound." That sentence landed like a tolling. The machine spirit's response was a shiver of metal and a sudden drop in the air pressure that forced everyone in the chamber to step back to steady their breathing. The thing in the sarcophagus laughed then, not in the manner of triumph, but in the ragged way of a wound healed badly and then reopened. "They said the fallen were the ones who left," it said, "but the true fallen were never those who left. It was those who stayed." The words opened a cavern in his understanding. If the true fallen included the ones who stayed, then the chapter's entire structure of penance and pursuit had been inverted. The hunt was not only an external cleansing, but an internal excision, a way to remove parts of themselves that might cause discomfort. The interrogator realized then that the rock's hunger might not be for absolution, but for exposure. The machine spirit, in its slow sentience, seemed to want to expel what had been hidden. The rock had been a jar in which things that did not fit were stored, and now its lid was rattling. He left the chamber with the retinue in mute procession, the sarcophagus's lid reclosing with a thud that sounded to him like a syllable cut in two. The air above ground felt different, thinner, as if the rock itself had exchanged one kind of breath for another. Men who had once greeted him with the measured nod of comradeship now looked as if they came from a different assembly of people. Their faces were less sure. There was, beneath the ordinariness of their steps, a new caution. He carried within him the weight of a secret that felt less like a possession and more like a disclosure that had been forced into being. In the nights that followed, the rock's soundscape shifted further. The drip became a more complex meter, the vox static sharpened with the intonation of argument. The oil from statues shimmered in shapes like letters that would not cohere. Men woke from their sleep with impressions they could not name. The interrogator, who had once recorded breaches in protocol with the same steady hand he used to annotate confessions, now found annotations in his own hand that were questions without answers. He recorded them anyway, because recording is how one delays judgment and makes it patient. Whether the chapter would absorb this revelation into yet another layer of secrecy, or whether it would crack and allow light to fall upon these things, was not yet decided. The rock itself seemed to have made its choice. It would not remain quiet. Its whisper became more than a lament. It turned into a clarion. Metal groaned, teeth of gears clacked like tiny castanets, and from the bellows of engines came a sound that, with enough grief and listening, could be parsed as an imperative. Disclose. When he retired to his cell, the interrogator placed his hand upon the rosary at his chest and thought of the faces in that sarcophagus. He thought of all the little ways the chapter had chosen to tidy its past. He considered that rulings made in haste had been enshrined as doctrine, and that the rock had conserved both the victims and the decisions that made them victims. He felt, for the first time in his life, not only the weight of duty, but the dread that duty can be corrupted by the very institutions meant to empower it. The revelation coiled under his ribs like a small animal. Alive, dangerous, perhaps beautiful in the way a truth can be beautiful when it shatters a complacent world order. He could imagine the long debate ahead, counsels and remonstrations, and the slow accretion of arguments. He could imagine what the librarians would say, what the senior counselors would insist, how the chapter would prefer to do what it had always done, to seal, to bind, to make silence more perfect. He also imagined the alternative, that the rock, that slow, sentient thing that fed on oath and oil, might force a reckoning. It had shown them a body fused into a sarcophagus, and had, in the doing, insisted that its keepers listen. The machine spirit was no longer content to be a simile. It wanted an accounting. In the end, the interrogator could not decide, for the night at least, what was the right course. He lay awake with the echo of the fallen thing's last sentence in his head, and it worked on him like a file. They said the fallen were the ones who left, it had said. But the true fallen were never those who left. It was those who stayed. He rolled the phrase in his mouth like a relic and felt its edges abrade the insides of certainty. The rock turned outside his cell as it always did, a slow, indifferent arc drifting in the black. But inside, something that had been sleeping for centuries had woken and was testing its voice. The machine spirit hummed like a throat clearing. The chamber doors closed, not with the finality of a sentence imposed, but with the suspense of a question left in the dark. I remember the exact temperature of the chamber when the first scream unlatched from the walls, a dry, metallic cold that carries sound with a cruel clarity. For a long time, the rock's noises had been small things, drips, the whisper of gears, the low conversational hum of engine and chant. Those sounds could be put to sleep with careful liturgy. But the scream was of a different order. It did not come from any throat within the retinue. It came from the stone itself, an elongated animal wail that opened like a seam across memory. It was not merely loud. It contained layers. The pitch of loss, the rasp of machinery grinding on bone, the thin, petulant edge of accusation. When it rang, the candles in the chapel guttered in counterpoint as if to cover their ears. The whispering had begun months before as a nuisance, then as a riddle. Now it had broken its restraint and become a cry that demanded an answer. The interrogator, my hands, my name, the voice that once spoke with clerical steadiness, felt it bloom inside me as something that dissolved the careful geometry of my days. For years I had catalogued sin, parsed testimony, bound confession in neat sentences, and sealed them in the chapter's ledgers. I believed atonement was procedural, a scale balanced by ritual, an equation solved by contrition. I was certain. Certainty is a warm place to live. It solaces you in the dark. It cushions the ribs when you sleep inside armor. Then certainty cracked. It came in fragments at first, images in the margins of my ledger. A child's hand wrapped in a banner, a captain crying and not being believed, a ledger entry crossed out with no reason given. The whispers offered me numbers and nights, coordinates and fragments of names. I pursued them the way a hunter pursues a trail, with patient step, method, and discipline. I believed I was retrieving truth from dust. I thought I was returning names to the light. In the rock we move by names. They are the keys to doors, the means by which a man is lifted or buried. The first full memory returned in the Cathedral of Engines, where the machine spirit's resonance coils like a throat. It was not a memory that arrived whole. It came like a file corrupted and then repaired with crude tools. Some lines would be clear, others jagged, others paging out of order. I saw myself standing at the edge of a pit of smoke and flame, the smell of burning ceramic and singed hair sticking to my nostrils. I heard orders, but their origin felt absurdly far away, voices issuing from the mouths of men who might have been me. Then, the recoil of a decision, the sharpness of a hand pressing a seal, the sudden closing of a gate. Faces rearranged themselves in that image like a toy theater put under a clamp. One man pleading, another resolute, others not looking up at all. In the center of the tableau, I saw a boy, no more than 19, strapped to a post. His mouth opened and made no sound because flame had claimed his throat. Someone had taken a ledger and written in the margin, "Heroic Necessity." Another hand had written over that in a nowhere script, a name that had been removed from every roll, one who had been folded into silence. When the memory spooled, then frayed and reknit, the realization broke through like daylight through a shutter. I had not only read these stories, I had been part of them. The ledger I had once catalogued with dispassionate strokes bore the fingerprints of my own pen. I had judged, I had signed, I had sealed, and I had done so under a rubric that read loyalty as the only possible virtue. The rest, mercy, doubt, a compassionate refusal of a cruel order, was not considered at best and punished at worst. I remember the exact moment I understood that my mind had been made clean in a way that left it sterile. It was in the small, cold room where I kept my rosary and the thin sheaf of handwritten notes I had made in secret. I flipped a page and found an annotation in my own hand that made no sense. A date I did not remember, a place I had never set foot, and beneath it the words, "Eradicate the witness, preserve the narrative." My hand trembled when I traced those letters. The handwriting was mine, no doubt of that, but the sentence felt like the echo of an order engraved on bone. Memory is a dangerous thing to recover. It is a compound of the mind and the world and a corrupt ledger of both. The rock has ways of securing memory, seals within seals, wards of ritual and machine, sarcophagi arrayed like teeth. For decades I had believed those methods were for the protection of the Imperium, to keep a faint, dangerous heresy from igniting again. I had been seduced by the idea that secrecy healed, but knowledge uncovered that night in the bowels of the rock corroded that seduction. The thing that had been hidden was not ephemeral. It was a decision, deliberate and communal, and administered by men who had worn the same sigils I had worn. We had not simply punished the clearly guilty. We had enclosed the inconvenient, the ambiguous, the merely unfortunate. Madness arrives as a gradual weathering. The first thaw is a cognitive dizziness, a sense that your edges are smoothing. Later it becomes a sensation of your bones loosening, and of the things that once defined you sliding in their sockets. For me, the line between order and erosion came when machinery began to speak in my own voice. The first time it happened, I thought fatigue had made my hearing traitorous. A servo pulse repeating a cadence that matched a line of liturgy I had chanted that morning. The next time, a hydraulic stutter sounded, and the pattern resolved itself into the syllables of a child's name I had never wanted to say aloud. The rock's inner life was a thickening chorus, and I was a listener whose nerves were too exposed. Then the machinery touched me. It happened slowly, a sensation at first, like a metallic draft moving across my skin. Later I saw the proof. Beneath the round of my collarbone, a filament that had not been there before winked into being, a hairline silver thread that gathered moisture, and then became a vein of copper beneath my flesh. I pressed my fingers to it and felt a warmth that was not human and not machine. It felt like a bridge being laid. The sensation was not painful. It was nearer to the chill of being seen. In the rock, the line between augmentation and possession is measured as a moral question. Men take enhancements for purpose. They allow grafts for war. But there is a threshold where addition becomes consumption, and beyond that a machine may not remain neutral. The first graft did not scream. It hummed. Small nodes sprouted at random locations, under a fingernail, behind an ear, at the base of the skull. They were tiny things, precise as seeds. I examined them with the kind of clinical fright that professionals have when their own instruments betray them. The librarian's psychometric scanners reported an anomaly. Local fields fluctuated with a signature akin to multiple minds layered in a palimpsest. In the rock, psychometry is a discipline of reading echoes. Now the echoes were reading back. Nightmares intensified. They used to be symbolic. Now they were literal. I dreamed of my hands becoming tools, my palms folding inward to reveal jointed recesses where filaments thrummed, where sensors shone like insect eyes. I dreamed my throat opened like a valve and a mechanical voice poured out of me, reciting orders I had never given. When I woke, I tasted oil and a preternatural sweetness that lingered at the back of my mouth like a memory not mine. As corruption of flesh advanced, other alterations followed. The more the rock inscribed itself into me, the less I recognized the man who wrote the ledgers and bound the confessions. Faces I had known blurred, and new ones overlaid them. Pale visages with the geometry of servo plates, and the stubborn melancholy of men who had decided to stop wanting. The library's old compasses, tools that once helped me weigh testimony, now spun with no stable north. I could no longer look at the slow burn of a candle without seeing the filament inside it. I could no longer hear a choir without feeling the pull of harmonic feedback inside my skull. Dreams collapsed into memories, and memories opened like sores. I saw a tribunal in which I had sat, the dais where verdict and sentence were personified by men in robes that matched the chapter's sobriety. A name was read aloud. I signed the record. The accused, a young serf who had been pressed into service and had, in a desperate night, refused a command that would have massacred his village, had been transferred into protective custody. The phrase had been used then as if language could turn a sin into a shield. The man had been kept alive, but only as a specimen, sealed in an internal chamber, fed what the rock allowed, then catalogued and occasionally examined as proof of necessity. I had signed his sequestration, justified in the name of expediency. Memory returned with a sharp, accusatory clarity. His eyes, when I had looked down at him, had not been angry. They had been pleading, and someone had pressed a seal across his mouth so that pleading would not be heard again. The shock of recognition is a violent thing. One can attempt to distribute it into rational compartments. I acted under orders. We were at war. We had no choice. But those stratagems begin to feel like paper props in a wind. The more I remembered, the more the scaffold of my own righteousness crumbled. Denial, I learned, is a labor-intensive machine. It requires constant motion. We must invent narratives, burn inconvenient records, adjust facts. It calls upon the whole apparatus of faith, law, and the machine spirit to sing in a chorus, whose intent is not only to protect the world, but to protect the protectors. Chaos, in the sense the codices warn against, is the thing that promises power for a price and then asks for a soul. In our stories, chaos invades, it corrupts, it promises, and it consumes. But what happened in the heart of the rock was not an invasion in the classical sense. It was revelation. The forces usually named chaos were less an army breaking down a wall than a vector through which truth was exposed. The warp is notoriously indiscriminate. It reveals and conceals with equal appetite. It does not always pull as an enemy would. Sometimes it reveals what has been threaded through the warp of institutions, and then sets that weaving to quiver. I felt that revelation as a pressure on my eyes. Worlds that had been properly obscured began to shimmer through the veil. The machine spirit, long a metaphor in our parlance for mood and mischance, became a conspirator in disclosure. Its voices, once the background hum of engine worship, rose to articulate a new litany. That the true heresy of the chapter was not treason in the battlefield sense, but the institutionalized erasure of the doubtful. The more I remembered, the more my sense of identity collapsed into a palimpsest of versions. There were parts of me that held fast, an oath given as a youth to defend, a childhood memory of warmth from a mother's hand, a laugh once shared in a common room. Those human traces clung like barnacles to a hull that was being refitted. But there were other parts, documents I had drafted, orders I had signed, names I had crossed out, that now read like the signatures of another. I could not reconcile them. My hand had written them. My mind had approved them. Yet their moral contour was not mine. It belonged to a ledger of necessity stitched into the rock's anatomy. The screams multiplied. They arrived both as sensory onslaught and as legalistic proof. In the engine rooms, the conduits chattered in patterns that matched the cadence of punitive decrees. In the chapel, the choir's counterpoint echoed ledger entries. The rock had become a chorus of its own history, but history was not being spoken as story. It was being recited as indictment. The machine spirit, which we had once placated with offerings of oil and rhyme, now asked in the only language a machine might know. Metrics. It showed throughput, the numbers of those excluded, the dates, the names. It placed them in a table and pulsed them across the cathedral's internals, making them visible as telemetry and thus undeniable. This is where madness, or something like it, takes root, not as sudden cruelty, but as the inevitable consequence of an overtaxed epistemology. I began to doubt the reliability of my own perceptions, and from doubt grew a mania to verify. I walked the lowest galleries with instruments humming, extracting data from the walls and the bones therein, demanding that the rock tell the truth in whatever language it had left. The readings were unsparing. Sealed chambers opened and contained bodies with graftings, ledgers of sentences that had no tribunal records beyond a single signature, legal forms affixed without the necessary witness. The rock presented evidence that it had kept with a zeal bordering on tenderness. It had not only confined bodies, it had conserved the marks of our decision. And yet, even as I confronted this evidence, something else happened that undermined the tidy logic of retribution. The machines that had gathered data began to echo the voices of those they recorded. Servitors, automatons used for menial labor, replayed phrases they had heard during communal tasks. A servoskull that had been used to record a confession now replayed, in static, the plea of a condemned man. The rock's instruments were not passive observers, they were participants. The thing we had once called the machine spirit behaved like an organism with a memory and a sense of shame. Perhaps shame is the wrong word for a machine, but consider, a machine that has been fed a culture is a machine that cannot be indifferent. The final collapse of my certainties did not happen in a single dramatic hour, but in a sequence of exposures that compounded into collapse. I read a confession in my hand and recognized the syntax of my own voice. I saw a ledger line I had penned and felt the chill of a stranger. I stood in a hall where the chorus of the rock repeated the phrase, "We were pushed," until it became a mantra. My mind, which had been the tool of adjudication, had been modified into the conduit for confession. In that breakdown there was no heroic resistance. There was only a terrible lucidity. Images of a tribunal where men signed away the names of neighbors, where security served as the justification for erasure. I saw my own hand move in the moment of sealing. I had been present and complicit. The rock had absorbed those actions and now bore them like a moral tumor. When I understood fully, a hollowness opened beneath my feet. It felt like vertigo, but worse, like the sensation of falling through all the roles you thought you were, into a place where the only clear fact was that you had been used by the very structures you believed you protected. The machine spirit did not gloat, it did not punish. It became, in its own way, a revealer. Its hunger had been not for flesh, but for truth. It wanted its archives unsealed. It wanted the witnesses to be heard. The rock had become emphatic. Then the voices rose, and the whispers became screams. The choir of the engine rooms and the chapel overlapped and formed a single truth tone. The fallen, those who had been sealed, who had been kept as specimen rather than judged with full justice, sang in a palette of voices that no longer resembled human singing alone. Their tones were overlaid with metal harmonics, their vowels threaded with static. They were not only alive in the way a heart beats, they were alive as data, as residual cognitive prints that could be played back, looped, slowed, transcribed. The rock had made life of them in a different register, and that life was now demanding a reckoning. It is at this point, amid what might be called revelation or judgment, that I finally remember hearing myself speak words that were not planned, and that belonged to someone else's script. I opened my mouth and said it aloud without choosing it. I remember now. The phrase surprised me internally. It surprised those around me. It ripped the caution from our faces. I said it because memory had become unavoidable. The rock had unlatched something in me that would not be resealed by liturgy. What followed was a confession that was not in the classical sense a private admission, but a public collapse. I spoke the names of places and nights, and the acts we had performed to tidy our past. I recited orders I had signed. I read, as if from a ledger that burned, the dates and the justifications. Each utterance felt like a shard sliding from a wound. The retinue, the librarians, the senior brothers, they heard me. Some stepped back as if struck, others covered their mouths and then their faces. A few stood expressionless as rocks, the old armor of denial not yet eroded. Madness, in the sense most fear, is the loss of fit with a shared reality. When I declared that I remembered, that I had been part of the sealing and the erasures, that I had permitted the conversion of living men into specimens of caution, reality around me shivered. The machine spirit answered with a cascade of stations opening, 100 sealed doors trembling, systems unweighting lids, sarcophagi coughing their dust. It was as if the rock, having carried the archive of our shame for centuries, now insisted we face it all at once. In that storm, something else peeled back. The distinction between loyal and fallen became an old and brittle fiction. The sarcophagi opened in rows and men, some twisted by graft, some gray with time, some nearly whole, rose and spoke. They did not speak in the language of accusation, but in the language of remembrance. They named those who had judged them. They did not all ask for vengeance. Some asked for simple acknowledgement. They named the nights they had been taken, the hands that had signed, the phrases used to still their pleas. The rock displayed the records, the signatures, the minutes, the anonymous warrants. There was no tidy moral calculus to be found. The fallen had been made in the same workshop as the loyal. The difference had been not always in hearts, but in the inventories of choices, and in the hunger of an institution to keep a story tidy. And in that hour of unsealing I heard, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, the terrible, precise summation. I remember now. We never fell. We were pushed, and they called it loyalty. The sentence landed like a decree. It was not a plea. It was a fact colliding with decades of myth. The men who had signed away names had turned necessity into doctrine, and then turned doctrine into legend. Where choice had been coerced, and where mercy had been denied, the chapter had crafted the mythology of betrayal. The lost were not all exiles to treason. Some had been constructed as examples by those who feared the messy calculus of compassion. To make the story clean, they had excised consistencies. After that, the rock did not stop. Its machine spirit, now in a full register, hummed the names of the sealed. Its servitors moved through halls and placed relics on altars. The chapel bells, long silent for ceremonial reasons, toll and their sound threw light on faces that had chosen to look away for years. The chapter was forced into a mechanism it had rarely practiced, public confession, not because of a pious choice, but because the Rock had rebelled and insisted on its archives being seen. What followed was a rupture in governance the likes of which the Rock had not seen in 1,000 years. Councils convened with the speed of emergency, and men who had been arbiters became defendants under the weight of documentary evidence. The procedural armor we had wrapped ourselves in did not hold. Ritual could not paper over raw evidence traced by the Rock's own instruments. Inquiry ensued, and it was terrible and honest. A forensic unpicking of a narrative that had been woven to assuage fear. Madness did not encompass us in the theatrical way some histories will later tell it. There was no universal descent into frenzy. Rather, the collapse of certainty produced fissures, and men fell into them according to the shape of their belief. Some chose to double down, defending every act as necessary. Others capitulated, confessing without the ritual of penance because they could not bear the sight of the men they had consigned to silence. A few disappeared into the lower galleries, with a look that suggested they were listening for commands that would no longer come. As for me, the confession became less an act of catharsis than an obligation, one I had been avoiding through decades of silent adjudication. I had been a man of the law of the ledger. Now I was a man of consequence. Memory had forced me to be both the accused and the witness, both guilty and recorder. My flesh was merging with machine, a fact that complicated any return to a previous self. The graphs had changed my thresholds. They had made me less entirely human in certain mechanistic operations. When I felt that, it was not as if something alien had invaded me. It was that I had allowed the Rock to become part of the way I perceived. The Rock had been part of my mind's furniture for longer than I had thought. In the aftermath, the dark angels did not collapse into villainy. We are not a simple people of monsters. There were acts of bravery and of extraordinary self-sacrifice as the truth was sifted. There were also acts of denial, of men who burned more records, who forged new signatures, who tried to push the evidence back into silence. The machine spirit resisted these moves with an obstinacy that felt almost moral. It threw up readouts, created anomalies that could not be hidden, let servitors replay old recordings in the ears of the very men who had engineered them. In short, it forced accountability as a machine might, by making concealment physically and evidentially impossible. But the most damning revelation was a philosophical one, that the greatest heresy we had practiced was not the embracing of other gods nor the falling to corruption. It was the structural denial of doubt. We had institutionalized certainty in order to survive, and in doing so, we had crafted a religion of silence that punished ambivalence as if it were sin. We had labeled hesitation treason. We had made mercy suspect. We had converted the messy calculus of human decisions into a categorical offense. We had acted as if to preserve the Imperium we must remove the fissures of humanity, and in doing so, we had averted justice for those who deserved it. I remember the final, strange solace that visited me in those hours of reckoning. It was not comfort as people understand it. It was a quieting more like the end of a long, terrible noise. The machine spirit, having revealed the ledger and the names, pulsed a single harmonic that matched the cadence of a lullaby. Its voice, if one could call it that, was not accusing now but exhausted. It had borne witness. It had done what machines, in their odd, amoral way, do best when they are fed with honesty. They organize and expose. The Rock had kept its archive and had finally insisted upon its publication. And I, fractured, grafted, culpable, stood in the cathedral and said aloud the facts no ritual could excuse. "I remember now," I said again, and then with a clarity that surprised even me, I added, "We never fell. We were pushed and they called it loyalty." The words were not a cry for absolution. They were a verdict. They were the final suture being cut. The aftermath is not a tidy thing. There were tribunals and reforms. and there were men who could not live with the shame and who sought final absolution in a way the chapter sometimes grants. On the field of battle, there were also men who doubled down and made the rock's own revelations into new canons of denial. It will take a long time, perhaps generations, for the balance to be rewrought. The machine spirit has returned in a way to its prior rhythm, but the tone is different. Its hum is threaded now with the cadence of record and with a new insistence on testimony. As for me, I remain something of both, witness and culprit, a man who must live with the fact that his hand has written names into darkness. My flesh and machine will continue to argue as to which impulses should shape me. I do not know whether I will ever be fully reconciled to either the deeds I permitted or the confessions I must still make. But this I know clearly. Our greatest sin was not a betrayal to some external power. It was the betrayal of our own capacity to hesitate, to doubt, to weigh each case with the mercy it might merit. My confession ends without the closure many desire. Some things cannot be reversed by liturgy or by legalese. The rock's memory will persist like a heart that has acquired scar tissue. It will beat differently now, and we will have to learn to listen to its new rhythms. The fallen did not simply leave us. Some of them were set aside, made examples, eaten by a system that needed tidy stories. The machine spirit, having become a kind of conscience, forced the light where there had been only shadow. They will speak of us in centuries as monsters or martyrs, depending on the victor of future debates. I do not care for posterity's comforts. I end by insisting that the record be clear. We did not fall in the proud, mythic way the old songs paint. We were pushed by fear, by the expediency of power, by the institutional hunger to make its past tidy. And then our enablers called that compulsion loyalty. I remember now. I remember with a clarity that will not be soothed. They told me, after the councils and the reckonings and the rancid business of unsealing, that the loudest work had been done. There were inquiries and apologies, ritual burnings of documents and the clumsy gestures of reform. There were proclamations that sounded like absolution and felt, at best, like first aid. Men who had been arbiters became defendants. Men who had been quieted were named. Sarcophagi were opened, and the names read aloud into halls that had not expected to hear them. The rock itself seemed, for a time, to breathe with a new steadiness. The drip that had run like a metronome slowed. The vox static thinned. The oil-stained statues were scrubbed and ceremonially riblessed. Outwardly, there was work, tidy, measurable work that could be reported and inscribed in minutes. It was a comfortable story to tell yourself as a brother of the chapter, that the machine of the monastery had been cleansed, and that the covenant of secrecy had been rebalanced through transparency. Comfort, as I learned, is an expensive habit. The outward repairs may have been real, they may have even been necessary. Yet beneath the renewed glazes, beneath the new notations and the public confessions, something quieter persisted. It had the patience of a thing that had made its home in bone and mortar, a whisper that would not be quieted by exposure. The calm that followed the storm was a particular kind of calm. It was not the peace of ignorance, but a subdued, prayer-like hush that had the metallic echo of people listening for consequences. Men moved as if their footsteps were instruments of atonement. In the chapels and in the workrooms, voices were quieter and measured like the careful ticking of a chronometer that had been reset. Candles burned in rows and the smell of incense was never stronger. Ritual served as balm and as mechanism. We told each other that this was recovery. We said that truth had been honored and that the rock had been faithful in revealing itself. We were careful, all of us, to speak in the tones that do not inflame. That was the story told in public. There was, however, another story that took more delicate shape in private rooms and in the small, painfully honest glances exchanged between brothers who had seen things with their own eyes. The interrogator, if you must call me that, though even that title now sticks with the feel of an old medal, kept a little ledger of such moments. It was not a ledger of facts, but a ledger of tremors. The flicker of a candle in a chapel that should not have shivered. a servitor pausing in its labor as if to listen, a junior brother waking in the middle of the night and finding his palms wet with oil though he had been sober all day. These were not the items that fit cleanly into reforms and tribunals. They were the residues of a deeper ordering that had not been so easily rewired. My voice, too, had altered. Where once my cadence had been human, measured, warm in the way that an organ in a chapel warms a winter room, it now carried a filament of something metallic. Perhaps it was merely the consequence of sleep lost and graft supplied. Perhaps it was the effect of living among humming engines that teach the body new harmonies. But there was more than physiology at work. When I spoke in the quiet after the storm, the words came with a resonance that suggested an instrument had taken on my inflections. Colleagues noted it with that awkward politeness soldiers have. They cleared throats and pretended not to care. I lived with it because I had no choice. The rock had insinuated itself into me, and my voice was now one of the channels through which it spoke. The rock, after the upheaval, resumed its slow drift through the void. It turned as it had always turned, altering course with the unbearable slowness of something too massive to hurry. From the outside, it might have looked unchanged, a dark, cathedral-shaped arc moving through a scatter of stars. From the inside, it felt different, not because the engines were new, but because the ledger of the place had changed its center of gravity. The memory had become less a silent skein and more an organ that insisted upon circulation. The rooms that had sealed themselves now unlatched with a protocol that required names and confessions. The sarcophagi that had been opened were left unsealed to catch the light. The statues that had wept oil now had their effluvia studied and recorded as a subject worthy of contemplation rather than an omen to be denied. Yet even as the rock made these procedural adjustments, it continued, always patient and immovable, to keep its own counsel. The whispers persisted. They were no longer mere background noise. They were a constant companion, an undertone to every ceremony and every conversation. In the small hours, when the chapel bells had tolled and the engine choir dimmed to a susurrus, I would sit and listen to the architecture itself. The voices I had first heard as intrusive murmurs had settled into a more formal litany. They recited names, not in the hurried way of accusation, but with the steady cadence of someone who reads a roll call until the last person is accounted for. The content of the whispers varied. Sometimes they were the recollection of long-dead testimonies, the exact wording of a warrant, the time a captain had failed to answer, the single hesitation that had tipped the scales. Sometimes they were less literal, impressions of a life, the sensation of a child's fingers tracing the knotwork on a banner, the smell of rain on a world that had been scorched by ordnance. These were not merely fragments. They were insistences that refused to be reduced to simple facts. They had shape and, over time, a kind of will. There is a certain cruelty in long memory. It remembers everything and so gives no respite. The rock's remembering was not vindictive. It was comprehensive. It refused to let the chapter present itself without blemish. It insisted that details remain. It would bring them up at odd times and set them before us like small altars. A scratched sigil on an otherwise perfect cuirass, a child's toy tipped under a stair, a list of transferred names where the margin had been carelessly erased. These small things reasserted themselves with the steady logic of a machine that had been instructed to archive regardless of consequence. The machine in the rock, call it a machine spirit if you will, though that phrase may now feel like a convenient metaphor, had become an interlocutor impossible to ignore. Its voice was not single-toned. It spoke in data and in scent, in the cold of a corridor and in the warmth of an engine room. It used our own instruments against us. The servitors that once did menial labor now carried tiny prints of evidence. The voxes that had once been used to transmit commands now repeated snatches of testimony in frequencies that caught the attention of men who could not be moved by mere ink. We had thought we controlled our tools. The rock had, in its slow, inexorable way, taught us otherwise. This is not to say that the men of the chapter became uniformly penitent. Human affairs are messier than Reformation pamphlets. Some of those who had once concealed deeds doubled down, rewording minutes and adjusting signatories with the old meticulousness of bureaucrats who believe that paper can remake truth. Others left in the night, choosing exile in the black for reasons both cowardly and brave. A few took to the field as penitent warriors, embracing death as a way to erase an inconvenient past, and many simply returned to their stations, burying their eyes in routine and letting the rock do what it would with its memory. As for me, my role changed from questioner to keeper, and at times, to a reluctant translator. The rock spoke and I listened, and then I tried to give form to what it said. Translation is a poor term for what I did. It implies a neutrality I did not possess. I had my own stains, my own signatures, but I had also been given, by consequence, the duty of being a bridge between a sentient architecture and human disputation. I read into the static and extracted phrases that could be quoted in the councils. I presented the patterns of dripping, of oil, of locked doors. I named the minor miracles and the minor cruelties. In doing so, I kept a foot in the place of confession and another in the workshop of record, balancing precariously. The voice that emerged when I read aloud from the rock's ledger surprised even me. It had acquired that metallic distance that folk had commented upon after the cleansing, an edge as if an instrument were filling the hollow left by certainty. It was not wholly human now. That change was not purely aesthetic. It altered how listeners perceived me. Where before a brother might lean in for pastoral counsel, they now consulted me as they might consult a device, expecting data, expecting a measure. The intimacy was diminished. Sometimes I mourned that loss, sometimes I understood its logic. Machines do not offer consolation, they offer clarity where clarity is demanded. Yet in the new clarity there was a small, stubborn mercy. The rock, relentless as it is, had revealed not only our crimes but our capacity for repair. The whispers were not only accusatory, they could be pleading as well. They named not only the verdicts but the people, wives, children, the small faces tucked into the margins of the chapter's history. For some of us, that naming became a form of solace. The machine, in insisting upon detail, had forced the chapter to consider the human dimensions of its acts. In so doing, it made possible a reconciliation that was not merely procedural. Still, the whispers never stopped. I have learned to live with them as others live with a recurring ache. They are not as sharp as they were at the height of revelation, nor are they benign. They continue to make their rounds through the rock structures, reciting names and incidents in a circular, patient tone. Sometimes the voices seem to argue with one another, a polyphony of remembrance that does not always harmonize. Sometimes they find a cadence that approximates grace. Occasionally, in the thin hours before dawn, I think I can hear a sorrow in them that is almost human. Faint, weary, like a soldier who has marched too far and now sits down to sleep and cannot still his mind. Perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson, that the rock's memory is not purely punitive. It is, in some of its aspects, compassionate in the mechanical way. It keeps what we cannot keep ourselves. It insists that the forgotten be noted. It waits, and in its waiting it creates a slow form of justice. Not the sudden, triumphant retribution of campaign, but the patient insistence that names be spoken, that details be accounted for, that history be messy and human rather than neat and heroic. In time, years perhaps, some wounds will be tended and some names will find more fitting places on the rolls. Some of the men we sealed away, those who had been forcibly catalogued as examples, may be interred with rites befitting the dignity they were denied. The chapter will change. It will not be the same as before, because it now bears the weight of an archive that will not be amended to suit pride. The rock will continue to drift and to keep its records. We will continue to listen. I do not offer you absolution in this small closing. There is no tidy redemption for what we have done and what we allowed. The work of repair is long and sometimes unbearably small, but there is, I think, a peculiar kind of promise in the rock's persistence. That memory, once liberated from the convenience of silence, will force a people to be measured again and again, and in that repetition there is a chance, however small, that justice will inch closer to mercy. Listen, if you can, to the hush that follows confession. It is not peaceful, it is the pause of a chorus preparing itself to sing again. The machine's spirit hums, the candles gutter and hold, the servitors shuffle. Somewhere in the catacombs, a sarcophagus breathes and settles, like a sleeper in a long rest. The rock turns imperceptibly in the black and the stars roll past, uncaring. And yet, even as the quiet settles, the whispers run like rivers through the stone. They will not be silenced by edict or by ritual. They are as patient as the dust that collects in ledgers, and as persistent as the engines that pulse through the monastery's ribs. Their presence is not simply an indictment of the past, but a reminder that accountability is a living thing, and living things cry out. In the silence between stars, they still whisper. Their wings are broken, but they are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.